Dr. Sarah Bennett's morning didn't start the way she had planned. Her old Honda Civic's check engine light had come on, making her late for her community research project in one of the city's underprivileged neighborhoods. After spending hours collecting data about local families' access to healthcare, she now found herself sitting on the hard wooden benches of courtroom 304, waiting for her turn to contest a parking ticket. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Judge William Hawthorne's courtroom. He sat high on his bench, his silver hair and black robe giving him an imposing presence. His reputation for being strict and unyielding had earned him the nickname the Hammer among local lawyers. Today, he looked particularly irritated as he worked through his afternoon traffic court cases. Sarah watched as person after person approached the bench. Most were quickly dismissed with fines, Judge Hawthorne barely looking up from his papers. She noticed how he seemed to give longer consideration to some people while rushing through others. As a policy researcher who studied patterns in the justice system, she couldn't help but observe these subtle differences in treatment. Case number 247, Sarah Bennett. The court clerk called out. Sarah stood up, smoothing down her casual jeans and simple blue sweater. She had come straight from her research site, not having time to change into more formal attire. As she walked to the podium, she felt Judge Hawthorne's disapproving gaze take in her appearance. Miss Bennett, you're here for a parking violation on Oak Street, correct? Judge Hawthorne didn't look up from his papers as he spoke. Yes, Your Honor, but I'd like to explain the circumstances, Sarah began, her voice clear and steady. The parking meter was. The citation clearly states you were parked in a loading zone during restricted hours. Judge Hawthorne interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes narrowed as he took in her casual appearance once again. Are you denying being there? No, Your Honor, but there were extenuating circumstances. The signs were partially covered by. Miss Bennett, he cut her off again, this tone dismissive. This court sees dozens of these cases every day. Everyone has an excuse. The fact is, you broke the law. The fine is $300. Sarah blinked in surprise. The standard fine for a first offense was usually $150. Your Honor, that's double the usual fine. I have a clean driving record, and if you just let me explain. Make that $400 for arguing with the court, Judge Hawthorne declared, banging his gavel. Pay the fine within 30 days or face additional penalties. Next case. Sarah stood there for a moment, stunned by the judge's harsh treatment. As a black woman with a PhD in public policy and years of research experience in judicial bias, she was all too familiar with the statistics behind moments like these. But experiencing it firsthand still stung. The bailiff stepped forward, gesturing for her to leave the podium. As she turned to go, she noticed Judge Hawthorne was already looking down at his next case file, having dismissed her completely from his mind. Walking out of the courtroom, Sarah pulled out her phone and checked her calendar. A small smile crossed her face as she saw tomorrow's appointment. Judicial Conference keynote speech. Racial disparities in traffic court sentencing. She had just experienced firsthand what her research had been showing for years. In her car, Sarah changed out of her casual clothes into the professional suit she kept for presentations. As she smoothed down her blazer, she thought about Judge Hawthorne's dismissive attitude. Tomorrow would be interesting, to say the least. She drove to her office at the Urban Policy Research Center, where her latest study on bias in traffic courts was printed and ready for tomorrow's presentation. The data was clear. Certain judges showed patterns of issuing higher fines to minorities, particularly in cases involving black women. As she reviewed her presentation slides one last time, she added a new statistic, her own case from today. One more data point in a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Tomorrow, she would stand in front of the city's judges, including Judge Hawthorne, and present these findings. Sarah packed up her materials for the conference, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. Sometimes, she thought, the best lessons about bias come from unexpected places. Judge Hawthorne had no idea that the woman he had just fined would be teaching him and his colleagues about judicial fairness tomorrow. As the sun set outside her office window, Sarah knew that tomorrow would be a day of reckoning, not just for Judge Hawthorne, but for the entire local judicial system. The next morning, Judge William Hawthorne adjusted his tie as he walked into the grand ballroom of the City Convention Center. The mandatory judicial conference wasn't his idea of a good time, but attendance was required. He found his assigned seat near the front, nodding to his fellow judges who were already settled in with their coffee cups and notepads. Another boring lecture about sensitivity, he muttered to Judge Thompson, who sat next to him. We could be clearing our case backlogs instead of sitting here all day. The conference organizer stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. Good morning, distinguished members of the judiciary. Our keynote speaker today is one of the nation's leading experts on racial disparities in traffic court sentencing. Please welcome Dr. Sarah Bennett from the Urban Policy Research Center. Judge Hawthorne's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. Walking onto the stage was the same woman he had fined just yesterday, except she looked completely different. Gone were the casual clothes, replaced by a sharp charcoal gray suit. Her confidence filled the room as she approached the podium, her heels clicking against the hardwood stage. Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Bennett began, her voice clear and professional. Before we dive into the data, I'd like to share a personal experience that happened just yesterday in one of our city's traffic courts. Judge Hawthorne's face grew warm. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Dr. Bennett described her experience in his courtroom without mentioning him by name. Several judges turned to look at him, recognizing the description of his courtroom and his typical handling of cases. This incident, Dr. Bennett continued, perfectly illustrates the findings of our 5-year study. She clicked to her first slide, showing a graph of fine amounts sorted by race and gender. As you can see, Black women are 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines for first-time traffic violations compared to other demographics. The data was undeniable. Judge Hawthorne stared at the numbers, seeing his own courtroom statistics highlighted in red. His hands grew clammy as he recognized patterns in his own behavior that he had never noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to notice. But this isn't about pointing fingers, Dr. Bennett said, her gaze sweeping across the room. It's about recognizing our blind spots and working to correct them. She clicked to the next slide, showing successful reform programs from other cities. As she continued her presentation, Judge Hawthorne found himself taking notes for the first time at one of these conferences. Each point she made was backed by solid research, presented with a clarity that couldn't be dismissed. The very things he had previously labeled as excuses were shown to be systemic issues affecting thousands of cases. During the Q&A session, another judge asked about solutions. Dr. Bennett outlined a comprehensive plan for reform, including standardized fine schedules and mandatory bias training. The goal, she explained, is not to shame anyone, but to create a fairer system for everyone. When the presentation ended, Judge Hawthorne couldn't join the other judges heading to lunch. He sat in his chair, reviewing his notes and the copy of Dr. Bennett's research paper that had been provided. The evidence was overwhelming, and his encounter with her yesterday was a perfect example of everything wrong with the current system. As the room cleared out, he noticed Dr. Bennett gathering her materials at the podium. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and walked toward the stage. She looked up as he approached, a knowing look in her eyes. Dr. Bennett, he began, his voice quieter than usual, I believe I owe you an apology. Judge Hawthorne, she replied, her tone professional but not unkind. I appreciate that, but more than an apology, I'm interested in change. He nodded, feeling the weight of his years of snap judgments and unconscious biases. Your research is eye-opening. I'd like to learn more about implementing these reforms in my courtroom. Dr. Bennett studied him for a moment, then reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card. My office hours are on Thursdays. If you're serious about making changes, we can start there. As Judge Hawthorne took her card, he realized this was more than just an awkward encounter. It was an opportunity for real change. The woman he had dismissed so easily yesterday was now offering him a chance to be part of the solution. I'll be there, he said firmly, knowing that his courtroom would never be the same again. Thursday afternoon arrived quickly, and Judge William Hawthorne found himself standing outside Dr. Bennett's office at the Urban Policy Research Center. Through the glass door, you could see walls covered with graphs, charts, and awards. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. Come in, Judge Hawthorne, Dr. Bennett called out. She was sitting behind a desk covered with research papers and a large computer screen displaying complex data charts. I appreciate you coming. Please have a seat. As he sat down, Dr. Bennett turned her computer screen so they could both see it. I want to show you something specific about your courtroom, she said, pulling up a detailed spreadsheet. We've been collecting data from all traffic courts in the city for the past 5 years. These are your numbers. The screen showed clear patterns in his sentencing. Black women received fines averaging 40% higher than white men for the same violations. Hispanic defendants were given fewer opportunities to explain their circumstances. First-time offenders from certain zip codes faced harsher penalties than those from wealthier neighborhoods. I had no idea it was this clear, Judge Hawthorne said, leaning forward to study the numbers. His face reddened as he recognized his own bias laid bare in the statistics. Most people don't, Dr. Bennett replied kindly. That's why data is so powerful. It shows us patterns we might miss in our day-to-day decisions. She clicked to another screen showing traffic stop locations across the city. Look at where most citations are issued compared to where police patrols are concentrated. For the next hour, Dr. Bennett walked him through her research. She showed how seemingly small decisions added up to significant disparities over time. Judge Hawthorne took detailed notes, asking questions and beginning to understand the full scope of the problem. The good news, Dr. Bennett said, pulling out a thick folder, is that we've developed a comprehensive program to address these issues. Several courts in other cities have already implemented it successfully. She spread out documents showing before and after statistics from other jurisdictions. Courts that had adopted her recommended changes showed dramatic improvements in equity without compromising public safety or law enforcement effectiveness. The first step, she explained, is implementing a standardized fine schedule that removes individual bias from the equation. Every first offense gets the same base fine, regardless of who the defendant is or how they're dressed. Judge Hawthorne thought back to how quickly he had doubled Sarah's fine based on her appearance and perceived attitude. That seems reasonable, he admitted. The second part involves mandatory waiting periods between cases, Dr. Bennett continued. Research shows that quick, back-to-back decisions increase the likelihood of bias affecting judgment. Even a 1-minute break between cases can improve decision-making. As she outlined more recommendations, including regular bias training and monthly data review sessions, Judge Hawthorne found himself growing increasingly engaged. These weren't just theoretical ideas, they were practical solutions that could make a real difference. Dr. Bennett, he said finally, I'd like to volunteer my courtroom as a pilot program for these reforms. If I'm going to change, I want to do it right. She smiled, pulling out another folder. I was hoping you'd say that. I already have the paperwork ready for a pilot program proposal. Your courtroom would be perfect for demonstrating how these changes can work in practice. They spent the next hour going through the details of implementing the program. Dr. Bennett explained how her team would help collect and analyze data, provide training for court staff, and measure the impact of each change. There will be resistance, she warned. Change isn't easy, especially in the legal system. Are you prepared for that? Judge Hawthorne thought about his years on the bench, about all the people who had stood before him hoping for fairness. Yes, he said firmly, it's time for change. As their meeting wrapped up, Dr. Bennett handed him a thick binder of materials to review. One more thing, she said, reaching for her checkbook. About that fine from Monday. No, Judge Hawthorne interrupted. I'm dismissing that citation. It was a clear example of the very bias we're working to eliminate. Dr. Bennett nodded appreciatively. Then let's put that energy into making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. As Judge Hawthorne left the office, holding his binder of materials, he felt both humbled and hopeful. He had come expecting a difficult conversation about his mistakes. Instead, he had found a path forward to becoming a better judge and a better person. Over the next few weeks, Judge Hawthorne's courtroom began to transform. Gone were the rapid-fire judgments and quick dismissals. Instead, a new system took shape, one that prioritized fairness and consistency over speed. The changes weren't easy. On the first day of implementing the new procedures, a line of frustrated defendants stretched out the door. Judge Hawthorne's clerk, Mary, kept glancing nervously at the growing crowd as they took their mandatory 1-minute breaks between cases. Your Honor, she whispered during one break, we're falling behind schedule. Maybe we should speed things up a bit? Judge Hawthorne shook his head, remembering Dr. Bennett's research about rushed decisions. The schedule will adjust, Mary. Fairness is more important than speed. As he handled each case, he found himself noticing things he had missed before. A young mother's hands shaking as she explained her expired registration, an elderly man's confusion about a complex parking sign, a teenager's first-time offense that previously might have earned a harsh fine now became an opportunity for education. But not everyone appreciated the changes. Judge Thompson, his colleague from the neighboring courtroom, confronted him in the judge's lounge during lunch break. "Well, what's gotten into you?" Thompson demanded, waving a court schedule. "Your morning docket is taking twice as long now. It's making the rest of us look bad." Judge Hawthorne poured himself a cup of coffee, taking his time to respond. "Did you know that our court has been showing significant racial and economic disparities in our rulings, James? The data doesn't lie." "Oh, not this again," Thompson scoffed. "You've let that researcher get into your head. We've always done things this way." "Maybe that's exactly the problem," Hawthorne replied quietly. "Maybe always isn't good enough anymore." Back in his chambers, Judge Hawthorne reviewed the preliminary data from his new procedures. Dr. Bennett's team had installed a simple software program that tracked his decisions, showing real-time statistics about fine amounts, dismissal rates, and hearing lengths across different demographic groups. The numbers were already showing improvement. The massive disparities in fine amounts were beginning to level out. More importantly, he noticed people leaving his courtroom with a different energy, less defeated, more respected, even when they received penalties. One evening, as he was preparing to leave, he found a handwritten note on his desk. It was from a defendant he'd heard that morning, a young black woman who had received a speeding ticket. "Dear Judge Hawthorne," the note read, "thank you for listening to my explanation today. Even though I still got a fine, it meant everything to be treated with respect and fairness. People in the community are noticing the changes in your courtroom." He carefully placed the note in a folder where he'd begun collecting similar messages. Each one reminded him why these changes mattered. That night, unable to sleep, Judge Hawthorne pulled out his old case files. He spent hours reviewing decisions from the past year, seeing them with new eyes. The patterns Dr. Bennett had shown him jumped out from every page. Harsh fines for minor infractions, quick dismissals of explanations, unconscious assumptions based on appearance or address. His wife found him still at his desk when she woke up early the next morning. "Well, have you been up all night?" she asked, concerned. "I've been thinking about all the people I might have hurt," he replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "All the times I thought I was being firm, but was really being unfair." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You can't change the past, but you're changing the future. That counts for something." Later that day, he emailed Dr. Bennett to schedule another meeting. The initial changes were working, but he wanted to do more. He had ideas about expanding the program, maybe even presenting their results to other judges. As he walked into his courtroom that morning, he noticed the usual tension in the room felt different. People still looked nervous. It was court, after all, but there was less fear, less resignation. "Good morning," he announced to the crowded room. "We'll take each case in order, giving everyone a fair chance to be heard. Thank you for your patience as we work to ensure justice is served properly." Looking out at the faces before him, Judge Hawthorne felt a deep sense of purpose. He wasn't just changing procedures. He was changing lives, one case at a time. And somewhere in the city, Dr. Bennett's research team was watching the numbers change, proving that justice could be both fair and effective. 3 months into the pilot program, Dr. Bennett sat in the back of Judge Hawthorne's courtroom, quietly observing the proceedings. The atmosphere was noticeably different from that day when she had stood before him as a defendant. The rigid tension had been replaced by an air of respectful attention. A young Hispanic man approached the bench, nervous but composed. He had been cited for an illegal turn at an intersection with a partially hidden sign. In the past, such a case might have been dismissed in seconds with a harsh fine. "Please explain your understanding of what happened," Judge Hawthorne said, his tone measured and attentive. The young man described how construction equipment had blocked the sign, providing photos from his phone as evidence. "Your Honor," the city prosecutor interjected, "the sign was still technically present, regardless of visibility." Judge Hawthorne considered this for a moment. The purpose of traffic signs is to inform drivers, not to trap them. Citation dismissed. He looked directly at the young man. "However, I encourage you to be extra cautious around construction zones in the future." Dr. Bennett made notes on her tablet, documenting not just the decision but the process. The changes were clear: longer hearing times, more evidence considered, and most importantly, more consistent rulings across all demographics. During the lunch break, she knocked on Judge Hawthorne's chamber door. He welcomed her in with a smile that would have seemed impossible 4 months ago. "I have the latest data analysis," she said, pulling out her laptop. "The results are even better than we hoped." She showed him charts comparing his current rulings to his previous patterns. The racial and economic disparities had decreased dramatically. "But there's something else interesting," she continued, pulling up another graph. "Overall compliance with court orders has increased by 40%. When people feel they've been heard and treated fairly, they're more likely to respect the court's decisions." Judge Hawthorne nodded, thinking about the changes he'd seen. "I had a defendant last week who came back just to show me he'd fixed his broken taillight. Said he appreciated being treated like a person instead of a case number." "That's exactly the kind of community impact we were hoping for," Dr. Bennett replied. "But now we need to think about the next step." She pulled out a proposal document. "The City Justice Committee is meeting next month. They're looking for presentations on successful judicial reforms. Your courtroom could be the model for citywide changes." Judge Hawthorne picked up the proposal, but his expression was troubled. "Some of my colleagues, they're not going to like this. Judge Thompson already calls me the reformer, and not as a compliment." "Change never comes without resistance," Dr. Bennett said firmly. "But we have something they can't argue with: data. Numbers don't lie, and our numbers show that fairness works." Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was Mary, the clerk, with an unexpected visitor, the young mother whose shaking hands Judge Hawthorne had noticed months ago. She had brought homemade cookies to the courthouse staff. "Judge Hawthorne," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. After you worked with me on a payment plan for my registration fine, I was able to get everything fixed. I even got a better job because I could drive legally again." After she left, Judge Hawthorne turned back to Dr. Bennett. "You're right. We need to present this to the committee. These changes aren't just about statistics, they're about people's lives." They spent the next hour outlining their presentation. Dr. Bennett would present the data and research, while Judge Hawthorne would share real examples from his courtroom. Together, they would show how simple changes could make a profound difference. "One more thing," Dr. Bennett said as she packed up her laptop. "Remember the parking ticket you gave me? It ended up being the catalyst for all this change." Judge Hawthorne chuckled, shaking his head. "Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best improvements." As Dr. Bennett left the chambers, she passed the afternoon's defendants waiting in the hallway. They looked nervous, but not defeated. The sign outside Judge Hawthorne's courtroom now read, "Justice through fairness and understanding." The simple words captured everything they had worked for over the past few months. But both Dr. Bennett and Judge Hawthorne knew their work was far from over. This was just the beginning of a larger change, one courtroom at a time. The City Justice Committee meeting was held in the grand conference room of the downtown courthouse. All 15 judges from the city's traffic courts were present, along with court administrators and legal observers. Judge Hawthorne adjusted his tie nervously as he watched them file in. Dr. Bennett stood confidently at the podium, her presentation ready. She had added last-minute data from the previous week, showing even more impressive results from Judge Hawthorne's courtroom. Judge Thompson sat in the front row, arms crossed, while other judges whispered among themselves. "Distinguished members of the committee," Dr. Bennett began, "3 months ago, we implemented a pilot program in Judge Hawthorne's courtroom. Today, we'll show you the remarkable results of that program." The first slides showed the dramatic changes in fine distribution across different demographic groups. The previously stark disparities had nearly disappeared. Then came the compliance rates: more people paying their fines on time, fewer repeat offenses, and higher rates of corrected violations. "But numbers tell only part of the story," Dr. Bennett said, nodding to Judge Hawthorne. It was his turn to speak. He stood up, walking to the podium with purpose. "3 months ago, I was part of the problem," he began honestly. "I made snap judgments. I let bias affect my decisions. I thought efficiency was more important than fairness." The room grew quiet. It was rare to hear a judge admit to such things. "Then something changed," he continued. Dr. Bennett showed me the data from my own courtroom, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. We implemented simple changes, standardized fine schedules, mandatory waiting periods between cases, and most importantly, a commitment to truly listening to each case. He clicked to the next slide, showing the daily operations of his courtroom. Yes, we take longer with each case. Yes, our docket moves more slowly. But look at the results. The evidence was compelling. Community trust in the court had increased significantly. Payment plans were being fulfilled at higher rates. Even court staff reported higher job satisfaction. Judge Thompson raised his hand. "This all sounds nice," he said skeptically, "but what about deterrence? Aren't we just going soft on violators?" Dr. Bennett stepped forward with more data. Actually, our stern fines weren't deterring violations. They were creating a cycle of poverty and repeat offenses. Under the new system, violations have decreased by 23% in areas served by Judge Hawthorne's court. Other judges began asking questions, showing genuine interest. How much did the training cost? How long did it take to implement the new procedures? What was the public response? Then a surprise speaker stood up. Mary, Judge Hawthorne's clerk, who had asked to address the committee. "I've worked in traffic court for 20 years, she said. I've never seen anything like the changes in our courtroom. People leave different now. Even when they get fines, they thank us. They understand the process. They trust the system more." During the break, several judges gathered around Dr. Bennett, asking for copies of her research. Even Judge Thompson was seen taking notes, though he tried to look disinterested. The committee chairman called for a vote on expanding the program. The tension in the room was thick as hands began to raise. One by one, the votes came in, 12 in favor, 3 against. The program would be implemented across all city traffic courts. After the meeting, Judge Hawthorne and Dr. Bennett sat in his chambers, processing the victory. "It's just the beginning," she said, already pulling out plans for the expanded program. "We'll need to train other judges, adapt the system for different courtrooms, monitor the results, and handle the resistance," Judge Hawthorne added, thinking of the 3 opposing votes. "Change isn't easy for everyone. But it's necessary," Dr. Bennett replied. "And now we have proof that it works." They spent the next hour outlining the training schedule for other judges. Dr. Bennett's team would need to grow to handle the expanded data collection. Judge Hawthorne would help train his colleagues, sharing his personal journey from skeptic to believer. As they wrapped up their planning, a news crew was setting up in the courthouse lobby. The committee chairman had arranged for them to cover the new program. Change was coming, ready or not. Looking out his chamber window at the city below, Judge Hawthorne thought about all the people who would be affected by these changes. Every person who would now get a fair hearing, every case that would be truly considered, every life that might be changed for the better. "We're really doing this," he said quietly. "Yes," Dr. Bennett smiled. "We really are." 6 months after the committee vote, the changes had spread across all city traffic courts. The local news stations had taken to calling it the Bennett-Hawthorne Reform, though Dr. Bennett insisted on calling it the Fairness Initiative instead. Training sessions were held every weekend in the courthouse conference room. Judge Hawthorne and Dr. Bennett worked together, teaching other judges how to recognize and overcome their biases. Some judges, like Thompson, initially attended with skepticism, but the results were hard to argue with. "Remember?" Judge Hawthorne told a group of his colleagues during one session, "It's not about being perfect. It's about being aware and making conscious decisions." He shared examples from his own experience, including the story of his first encounter with Dr. Bennett. The changes weren't without challenges. Some days, the court calendars ran long. A few vocal critics complained about wasted time and coddling violators, but the data kept proving them wrong. One morning, a reporter from the city's main newspaper sat in on Judge Thompson's court, now reformed according to the new guidelines. The case before him involved a young black woman with expired tags. "Ms. Jackson," Judge Thompson said, "following the new protocols, please explain your situation." The woman described losing her job and having to choose between feeding her children and renewing her car registration. Under the old system, she would have received a maximum fine without discussion. Instead, Judge Thompson listened carefully. "Given your circumstances," he said finally, "I'm going to reduce the fine and set up a payment plan. However, you must show proof of registration within 30 days. Can you do that? Yes, Your Honor, she replied, tears in her eyes. Thank you for listening. Later that day, the reporter interviewed Judge Thompson. I was against these changes at first, he admitted. But seeing people leave court with dignity, seeing them actually follow through with their commitments, it's changed my mind. Dr. Bennett's research team had expanded to handle the increased data collection. They now occupied an entire floor of the Urban Policy Research Center, tracking results across all city courts. The walls were covered with charts showing the program's impact, decreased repeat offenses, increased fine collection rates, and most importantly, equal treatment across all demographic groups. One afternoon, Judge Hawthorne visited their office, bringing coffee for the tired researchers. Dr. Bennett was surrounded by papers, preparing for an upcoming National Justice Conference. Look at this, she said excitedly, showing him a new report. Other cities are requesting our data. 3 state capitals want to implement similar programs. This could go nationwide. Judge Hawthorne picked up one of the reports. Did you see the letter from the state Supreme Court? They're interested in expanding these principles beyond traffic court. One step at a time, Dr. Bennett smiled. But yes, the possibilities are exciting. Their conversation was interrupted by Mary, who rushed in with breaking news. The City Council had just voted to make the Fairness Initiative permanent, with guaranteed funding for the next 5 years. And there's more, Mary added. Remember that mother from last month, the one with the expired tags? She came by today. She not only got her registration updated, but she's also helping other people understand their rights in court. She started a community support group. This was the kind of change they had hoped for, not just in the courtroom, but in the community. People were beginning to see the court system as a place of justice rather than just punishment. That evening, Judge Hawthorne sat in his empty courtroom, thinking about how much had changed. The old signs about zero tolerance had been replaced with new ones explaining defendants' rights and resources for assistance. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Bennett. National Justice Reform Conference accepted our presentation. We're keynote speakers in Washington next month. As he drove home, he passed the spot where he had once given Dr. Bennett that fateful parking ticket. What had seemed like a routine traffic matter had sparked a revolution in judicial fairness. The next morning's docket would be full, but now it was different. Each case would get proper attention. Each person would be heard. And somewhere in the city, Dr. Bennett's team would be watching the numbers, proving that justice could be both fair and effective. The Bennett-Hawthorne reform was more than just a program now, it was becoming a movement. And it all started with one parking ticket and 2 people willing to admit that change was possible. 1 year after the initial parking ticket incident, the National Justice Reform Conference was packed with judges, lawmakers, and researchers from across the country. The main hall of the Washington Convention Center buzzed with excitement as Judge Hawthorne and Dr. Bennett prepared to deliver their keynote address. Ready? Dr. Bennett asked, adjusting her presentation notes. Judge Hawthorne nodded, thinking about how far they had come from that first confrontation in his courtroom. The conference chairman stepped up to introduce them. Our keynote speakers today have revolutionized the way we think about traffic court justice. Their program has shown remarkable results in reducing bias, increasing compliance, and building community trust. As they took the stage together, Judge Hawthorne saw Judge Thompson in the audience, sitting with several other judges from their city. He had become one of their strongest supporters, even helping to train judges in neighboring cities. Dr. Bennett began their presentation with a simple story. 1 year ago, I received a parking ticket. The audience listened intently as she described that day in court, then showed how it led to a complete transformation of their city's justice system. Judge Hawthorne then shared his perspective. I was that judge, the one who made snap judgments, who let bias cloud my decisions. But thanks to Dr. Bennett's research and patience, I learned to be better, and our entire system became better. They presented their latest data, a 60% reduction in fine disparities across racial and economic groups, a 45% increase in violation correction rates, and a 70% improvement in community trust ratings. The numbers told a powerful story of change. During the question and answer session, a judge from Texas stood up. This all sounds good, he said, but what about smaller courts with limited resources? Dr. Bennett smiled. That's why we've created a basic starter kit. Simple changes like standardized fine schedules and mandatory cooling off periods between cases cost nothing but can make a huge difference. After their presentation, judges and court administrators crowded around them, eager to learn more. 23 cities signed up immediately to implement the program. State Supreme Court justices requested detailed proposals. Later that evening, at the conference dinner, Judge Hawthorne and Dr. Bennett sat with Mary, who had come to support them. She had been promoted to chief court administrator, helping to oversee the program's expansion. Remember how worried we were about falling behind schedule? Mary laughed. Now other courts are calling us for advice on how to slow down and do things right. The conference chairman approached their table with unexpected news. The Department of Justice had taken notice of their program. They wanted to create national guidelines based on the Bennett-Hawthorne model. As they celebrated this latest success, Dr. Bennett's phone buzzed with a message from her research team back home. The latest numbers showed something remarkable. Their city's traffic court had the highest satisfaction ratings in the country, across all demographic groups. "We did it," she said quietly, showing Judge Hawthorne the message. "We really did it." The next morning, before flying home, they walked around the National Mall. Standing before the Supreme Court building, Judge Hawthorne read its famous inscription, "Equal justice under law." "You know," he said, "a year ago, I thought those were just words. Now I understand they're a promise, one we have to work every day to keep." Dr. Bennett nodded. "And it all started with a parking ticket." Back home, their work continued. New judges were trained, data was collected, and more improvements were made. The program evolved and grew stronger, but more importantly, people's lives were changing. One afternoon, a young law student interviewed them for her thesis. "What's the most important lesson from all this?" she asked. Judge Hawthorne and Dr. Bennett exchanged glances. Then Dr. Bennett answered, "That change is possible. That one small moment of unfairness, when addressed honestly, can lead to waves of positive change." And, Judge Hawthorne added, "that true justice requires both courage and humility, the courage to admit when we're wrong, and the humility to learn how to do better." As they walked out of the courthouse that evening, they passed a line of people waiting for the next day's traffic court. Unlike a year ago, there was no fear in their eyes, no resignation to unfairness. Instead, there was something new: hope. The Bennett-Hawthorne reform had become more than just a program. It had become proof that justice could be truly equal, one courtroom at a time, and somewhere in the city, another judge was learning to look past their biases, another defendant was being heard, and another small step toward fairness was being taken.